Y'all, this isn't just chaotic. This is devastating because what Claressa Shields just revealed on Instagram Live has the entire internet frozen, stunned, and furious. The woman known for being fearless was breaking down, hands trembling, face drained. And then she unleashed a truth nobody was prepared to hear. She said she's carrying a child, and the reason she kept it hidden, because the man she believed in, the man who swore he'd stand beside her, allegedly deceived her without blinking. Claressa Shields didn't just confess a hidden pregnancy, she uncovered what she says was a deliberate betrayal. She told the world that behind closed doors, Papoose allegedly painted her a fantasy, commitment, loyalty, a lifetime. She says he convinced her his marriage was finished, that paperwork was filed, that she was the future. And here's where it turns sinister. Claressa claims she gave her heart, her body, and her destiny to those words. Words she now believes were carefully scripted. Lies. She says she kept quiet about the baby out of terror that the moment he knew, he'd vanish. And according to her, that's exactly what he did. The second she said, "I'm pregnant, we need to make this official," everything allegedly collapsed. Suddenly affection became suspicion. Suddenly promises became excuses. Suddenly she was questioned, rejected, and erased. And while she was left expecting and isolated, he allegedly returned to New York, back to Remy Ma, living untouched by the chaos.no protection.no support.no remorse, only disappearance. This isn't just a love gone wrong. This is a woman saying she was emotionally manipulated, financially misled, and deserted at her weakest hour. And now the question echoing everywhere is haunting. Was this deception planned from day one? Was the public divorce only a performance? And did an unborn life become collateral in a celebrity secret world? Because if Claressa Shields is telling the truth, this isn't rumor anymore. This is a heartbreak.
Y'all knew my man had to come through for the baddest, for his queen. He came, Louis Vuitton travel right bag with the...
Strap in, because what's coming next isn't gossip traded in shadows. This is a statement delivered straight to the public courtroom, where silence becomes proof and every tear becomes testimony. This story isn't begging for pity. It's demanding to be heard. The screen lit up and the armor disappeared. No glam team. No edits. No music to soften the moment. Just a woman fighting through heartbreak, eyes burning, breath uneven, proving that even the strongest can fracture. Her opening words weren't theatrical. They were urgent. The kind spoken when a secret has been suffocating you and you finally surrender. She said she was expecting, not for attention, not for headlines, but as a truth she'd been hiding in terror. The air changed. Audiences went silent. Timelines stopped scrolling. This wasn't a reveal, it was an admission. And then she explained why she kept it buried. Not shame, not strategy, fear. The kind that grows when promises start feeling scripted and tomorrow keeps getting postponed. According to her, it didn't start messy. It started hopeful. Late-night conversations that sketched a future in permanent strokes. Marriage floated casually, then deliberately. Divorce described as finished business, then urgent reality. Statements spoken with certainty, repeated until they felt like destiny. She says she was assured the past was sealed, that legal moves were already in motion, that public truth was only waiting on timing.
And I went and spent a good 90K on my wrist, and then I got a good 60K in my hand. You feel me? Yeah. This that fight money.
This that fight money.
Fight for real. Yeah, knock him out, Debo. See Debo. Yeah, a little 90K on the mold.
She trusted it, and trust rewires everything. Trust opens doors. Trust softens defenses. Trust is how walls come down and futures get drafted. She says intimacy didn't come from impulse, it came from certainty. She says nothing about it was careless. It was intentional, built on the belief that commitment was already secured. Then the future started dragging its feet. Days slipped by. Confirmations never arrived. Excuses piled up. Comfort became reactive instead of reassuring. Still, she says she stayed, because trust doesn't disappear overnight, it corrodes. And when she discovered she was pregnant, that corrosion turned into fear. She stayed quiet. No posts. No confidence. No celebrations. Only waiting. Why wait? She says the answer is painfully clear. Because she knew the truth would rearrange everything. Because she'd watched affection fade the moment responsibility walked in. Because the love she was offered suddenly felt delicate, conditional, dependent on timing. So she wrapped herself in silence. When she finally spoke, she says the reaction wasn't happiness. It wasn't concern. It wasn't accountability. It was withdrawal. The voice changed. The energy shifted. Questions sharpened into weapons. Warmth evaporated. Suddenly timelines were interrogated. Loyalty was doubted, and partnership turned into an investigation. She says she went from future wife to suspect in a single Conversation. Then came the challenges. Paternity questioned. Motives dissected. Trust flipped upside down. In her version, the turn was merciless. The same man who once mapped out forever now scrutinized her character. The same confidence that promised stability now dodged obligation, and the shock wasn't just private, it played out in public, because while she was drowning in fear and uncertainty, she says he vanished, not briefly. Not discreetly. He returned to familiar territory, resurfacing beside the very past he claimed was finished. Images appeared, laughter looked natural, normalcy resumed. The contrast cut deep. One life never skipped a beat. The other was forced to freeze. That's when understanding arrived. Not comfort, understanding. The realization that the divorce speeches, the public pressure, the dramatic stance may not have been about closure at all, but about optics, about control, about maintaining two realities without consequence. She claims she was utilized. Emotionally first, then financially, that her presence had value only while it served a narrative, that her silence was expected once it no longer did, that the pregnancy didn't complicate the story, it revealed it. The live stream audience watched as she steadied herself and pressed on. This wasn't fury, this was documentation. Dates recalled, messages summarized, behavior patterns traced, the kind of testimony that whispers because it doesn't need to shout. Every sentence carried gravity. She didn't beg for verdicts, she asked for clarity. She admitted flaws, but claimed honesty. She said she never wanted to be news, but she refused to vanish. That hiding the pregnancy wasn't disgrace, it was survival in a situation that felt unsafe. And then came the sentence that shifted the air. She said she would not accept blame for shielding her child. That silence is not guilt. That trusting the wrong person does not make you responsible for their decisions.
I'm self-made, self-built. I got $8 million. Are you dumb?
The digital courtroom erupted without warning. Clips flew across timelines. Commentary ignited. Support clashed with suspicion, and the questions multiplied, not just about the romance, but about a pattern. About how certainty is often used to hide hesitation, how promises become placeholders, how women are asked to wait while someone else controls the clock. This wasn't delivered as vengeance. It was delivered as evidence. A refusal to let the story be rewritten by disappearance. She admitted the danger of speaking, the backlash, the labels, but she said silence was more dangerous because staying quiet meant accepting blame she didn't earn, that her truth deserved light, even if it unsettled reputations. As the live continued, something changed. Not relief, resolve. She said she was finished guarding a version of events that never guarded her, finished shrinking so someone else could remain comfortable, finished swallowing doubt so accountability could be avoided. There was no dramatic exit. No countdown. No ultimatum. Just one final thought that lingered heavier than any accusation. That truth doesn't need volume, but when it enters a room, nothing stays the same, and everything changed. Because this isn't simply about a romance that collapsed. It's about who controls the narrative, who benefits from silence, and what happens when the person expected to disappear decides to testify. It's about the price of trusting promises designed to serve one side more than the other, about how love can transform into litigation the moment consequences arrive. The record is now open. The audience is restless, and the questions refuse to fade. If her account holds, this wasn't confusion, it was calculation, not misunderstanding, but orchestration. Not only heartbreak, but abandonment at the precise moment protection mattered most. And if this testimony proved anything, it's this. Silence can be demanded, but it cannot be owned forever. When it finally breaks, it doesn't whisper. It leaves a record.
So you got Pap's name tatted on you?
Yeah.
Oh. Mm-hmm. Okay. So it's the first time you ever got a man's name tatted?
Yeah.
Shout out to that.
Are you crazy?
I already knew the answer. I just had to ask.
Oh, I said, who else deserves to have their name tatted on my body?
Just Pap.
That's it. Papoose.
The silence that followed didn't soften anything, it sharpened it. What came next unfolded not in whispers, but in fragments scattered across timelines, comment sections, and late-night voice notes dissected by strangers who suddenly felt like witnesses. Her account didn't fade after the live ended. It multiplied. Screenshots resurfaced. Old interviews were rewatched with new suspicion. Every smile was reinterpreted, every pause examined like evidence that had been hiding in plain sight. According to her version, the aftermath was colder than the buildup. Messages went unanswered. Calls were shortened, then avoided. The cadence of communication changed from reassurance to distance, from certainty to technicalities. She says concern was replaced by calculation. The focus wasn't on her health, or the reality of what she was carrying, but on optics, how this would look, who would say what, and how fast control could be regained. She describes being told to slow down, to not rush announcements, to keep things private for now. The same privacy that once felt intimate now felt strategic. The The same discretion that once protected a relationship now shielded someone else's freedom. And as days passed, she says the responsibility of silence shifted entirely onto her shoulders. What unsettled observers wasn't just the denial she claims followed, but the speed. One moment there were plans. The next, there were disclaimers. She recounts conversations where timelines were suddenly fuzzy, where promises were reframed as misunderstandings, where words once spoken with certainty were reclassified as hypotheticals. The ground didn't crack, it slid. Then came the images. Not announcements, not statements, images. Familiar locations. Familiar company. Laughter captured without context, but heavy with implication. To her, those images weren't just painful, they were instructive. They told her where she stood without a conversation. They closed doors she hadn't realized were already shutting. In private, she says she was urged to consider all possibilities. Language that sounded neutral but felt accusatory. Questions posed as concern but landed as suspicion. She says the implication was clear: doubt first, support later, if at all. And in that space, she realized the story she'd been living inside no longer belonged to her. As the public reacted, the narrative began to splinter. Some questioned her timing. Others questioned her motives. A familiar cycle took shape. Credibility debated, character weighed, empathy rationed. She watched as strangers argued over whether pain needed to be palatable to be believed. Whether composure determined truth. Whether a woman could be both strong and wounded without one negating the other. She didn't respond immediately. She says she waited because reacting felt like feeding a machine that was already hungry. But the longer she waited, the louder the speculation became. Silence was no longer neutral, it was interpreted. So she spoke again, not louder, but clearer. She reiterated that she wasn't asking for permission to tell her story. She was documenting it. Her emphasis shifted from romance to responsibility, from emotion to sequence. She outlined how expectations were set, how assurances were repeated, how decisions were made in reliance on those assurances. This wasn't about feelings, she insisted. It was about reliance. About what happens when someone builds a future based on representations that later dissolve. Observers noted the change in tone. Less vulnerability, more resolve. Less pleading, more precision. She wasn't trying to win an argument. She—
Look at him, man. Papoose, Papoose, Papoose. 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 Papoose.
Can't be on it, cause I be on that mug.
Papoose. Yeah. Papoose. 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 Every time I say his name, we get more and more comments. You get the flying. Papoose.
The tension didn't dissipate, it concentrated. What followed wasn't resolution but recoil, a tightening of narratives as every side adjusted to the fact that the story no longer moved on a single track. Analysts, commentators, and anonymous insiders began to frame what had already been said as if it were evidence, not emotion. Timelines were reconstructed. Language was parsed. Silence was treated as subtext. The most striking shift came in how the conversation changed tone. The focus moved away from personalities and toward patterns. Viewers stopped asking who is right and started asking how this keeps happening. How certainty is promised before it's earned. How futures are sketched before responsibilities are accepted. How the burden of proof is quietly reassigned when consequences arrive. She stayed visible, but not reactive. There were no daily updates, no spirals, no attempts to outpace speculation. Instead, she appeared measured, deliberate, as if every word carried a cost she was no longer willing to overpay. When she spoke, she returned to sequence, not sentiment. What was said, when it was said, what followed, what didn't. That steadiness unsettled people. It disrupted the expectation that pain must be loud to be credible. Critics searched for contradictions and found none that mattered. Supporters searched for catharsis and didn't get it. What they got instead was consistency. The same account, delivered without escalation, without embellishment, without retreat. Then the ripple effects began. Old footage resurfaced, not because it proved anything new, but because it sounded different now. Statements once brushed off as generic took on sharper edges. Casual remarks about timelines, loyalty, and priorities felt less casual in retrospect. It wasn't that the past had changed, it was that the lens had. She addressed the growing archive with restraint. She refused to narrate every clip, declined to assign motives to every frame. She said the record could speak without her directing it. That insistence on restraint became its own statement. In a space built on amplification, refusal became control. The question of accountability returned, heavier this time. Not as a demand, but as an absence. People noticed what wasn't happening. No clarification. No acknowledgement. No attempt to meet the substance of the claims with substance of their own. The quiet stretched, and with it, interpretations hardened. Some framed the quiet as dignity. Others called it avoidance. But even those inclined to defend struggled to explain why reassurance had once been abundant and was now non-existent. Why certainty had evaporated exactly when certainty was most needed. Why a situation that demanded care received distance instead. She spoke again, briefly, to address the one issue she said mattered above all else: safety. Not physical spectacle, but stability. She talked about building routines, seeking support, prioritizing health. She avoided naming names. She avoided rehashing details. She centered the present, not the conflict. That choice shifted the temperature. The story stopped being about exposure and started being about endurance. And endurance, it turns out, is harder to dismiss. The narrative reached a point where outrage could no longer sustain itself without substance. The easy arguments ran out. What remained were questions without satisfying answers. The kind that don't trend but linger. What responsibility looks like when plans dissolve. What honesty requires when promises are remembered differently. What silence costs when someone else is left to explain everything. Observers noted how often the burden had shifted to her to prove restraint, credibility, patience. How rarely the same standards were applied elsewhere. The imbalance became part of the story, not as accusation, but as observation. The discourse fractured again, this time along quieter lines. People shared their own experiences, not to compare, but to contextualize. Stories of being assured, then abandoned. Of timelines that moved only one way. Of commitments that dissolved under scrutiny. The individual narrative became collective, not because it was unique, but because it was familiar. She acknowledged that familiarity with a single sentence that carried more weight than any accusation. This isn't rare. That line landed because it didn't ask for outrage, it asked for recognition. As the weeks passed, the story stopped accelerating and started settling. Not fading, but solidifying. The facts as she presented them remained unchanged. The responses remained absent. The room stayed rearranged. In that stillness, the tragedy sharpened. Not because of spectacle, but because of what couldn't be undone. Trust extended can't be recalled. Time invested doesn't reset. Expectations built don't evaporate just because they become inconvenient. She didn't frame herself as a victim. She framed herself as responsible for herself, for what she carries, for the truth as she knows it. That framing denied critics their easiest angle. There was no collapse to exploit, no chaos to mock. Just resolve. The final shift came quietly. Attention moved on as it always does. New stories crowded feeds. New controversies demanded reaction. But this one didn't disappear. It stayed, referenced in passing, invoked as example, cited without explanation. A shorthand for a pattern people recognized without needing details. She remained consistent to the end. No dramatic closer. No call for judgment. No demand for apology. She said what she needed to say, then stopped. That choice marked the true end of the spectacle and the beginning of consequence. Because when a story ends without reconciliation, it doesn't vanish, it integrates. It becomes part of how people listen next time. Part of how promises are weighed. Part of how silence is interpreted. The tragedy here isn't confined to a relationship or a moment. It's in the space between assurance and action. In the gap where responsibility should have been. In the quiet that followed certainty, and the clarity that arrived too late to prevent damage, but just in time to prevent erasure. Nothing about this resolves cleanly. There is no final statement that ties it up. No mutual agreement that restores balance. What remains is a record, spoken carefully, maintained consistently, and left intact. And records have a way of outlasting reactions. The room is quieter now, but it hasn't returned to its original shape. It can't. Something was said that can't be unsaid. Something was seen that can't be unseen. And even as attention drifts elsewhere, the structure of the story holds. Not because it was shouted, but because it was sustained. That's the part people don't anticipate, the endurance of a narrative that doesn't chase closure. It doesn't demand belief. It simply refuses to disappear. And in that refusal, the truth, whatever each person believes it to be, continues to exert its weight. The story doesn't end here. Every screen, every timeline, every comment thread is now a witness. The weight of what was said, what was hidden, and what was revealed hangs heavy in the digital air. People are watching. People are judging. But more than that, they are questioning how far manipulation can reach when promises are weaponized and trust is exploited. Every viewer now carries a piece of this narrative. Every share amplifies the consequences. She has spoken. She has revealed. She has endured. And now the world must decide what it does with the truth. Will it normalize